This is a real interview, translated into English. You can find the original story via the link in the description. Hi, my name is Olga. I live in New Zealand, in the city of Dunedin. I moved here from Russia, from Vladivostok. I arrived in New Zealand in 2013, so I have been living here for about 8 years now. At that time, I was trying to figure out what kind of life I wanted to build abroad. At first, I did not live in Dunedin. I initially moved to Invercargill. I came to New Zealand on a student visa and studied there. My studies lasted about a year and a half, and honestly, it took me some time to figure out how the system worked and what to expect. After that, I stayed in Invercargill for a while, then moved to another city for work. Later, I returned to Invercargill again, but this time for a different job. In the end, I ended up living in Dunedin, where I am now. So yes, I have lived in several different cities. I mostly ended up in smaller towns, not in the capital. All these places were located in the south of the country, on the South Island, actually in the very southern part of New Zealand. I moved to New Zealand when I was already an adult, and at first, I really struggled with many things. A new country, new rules, and a completely different way of life. This experience later made me think a lot about whether I want to settle down here long term, and it became a very important part of my life. I moved to New Zealand when I was 25 years old. I left Vladivostok on my own. I moved alone, without family or friends, and at that time, I really had to figure out everything by myself. I struggled in the beginning because I had to build my life from zero in a completely new country. Coming alone meant that I had no support system here, and I had to learn how to be independent very quickly. This experience later influenced how I think about life, stability, and whether I want to settle down in one place or keep moving forward. I moved to New Zealand on a student visa and came here to study. I studied at the Southern Institute of Technology, SIT, which is located in Invercargill. I enrolled in a postgraduate diploma in business enterprise. In New Zealand, education is divided into levels, and my program was level 8. At that time, I was still trying to figure out how the education system here works and what to expect from it. Before that, I studied in Vladivostok. My major there was marketing, more specifically, analytical marketing. Because of this background, business was already connected to my previous education. This connection was important because it made it easier for me to get a student visa. My studies in New Zealand were directly related to what I had studied before. At first, I thought it would be something similar to a master's degree, but later I realized that it is a bit different. Level 8 here is closer to what we call a specialist degree back home. So in terms of level, I basically ended up studying at almost the same academic level as in Russia. The main difference was the program itself. In New Zealand, the program was shorter and much more practical. It was strongly focused on starting your own business. We studied subjects that help you open and manage a business: planning, basic finance, entrepreneurship. Because the program was very hands-on, I sometimes struggled with the lack of theory compared to what I was used to before. At the same time, it helped me understand whether this practical approach suits me, and if this is the direction I want to settle down in professionally. Overall, it was not a broad theoretical education like in Russia, but a very specific and practical one, designed for people who want to run their own business. If I try to summarize and evaluate my education in New Zealand, especially compared to my education in Russia, I would honestly say that, for me, it was more of a visa-related step than a truly valuable academic experience. At that stage, I was mostly trying to figure out how to stay in the country legally and what options I had. To be very direct, I really did not like the education where I studied in New Zealand. In my personal experience, the quality was quite weak. When I compare it with my university in Vladivostok, my department and my major there were much stronger. The teachers, the structure of the program, and the overall level felt much more solid in Russia. At SIT, where I studied in New Zealand, the program felt quite basic. It did not give me deep knowledge, and academically, it was much weaker than what I had before. Because of this, I often struggled with motivation and felt disappointed with the level of education. However, it is important to understand the context. Invercargill is a very small city located in the far south of the country. It is quite remote and not very popular. Because of that, strong specialists usually do not want to stay there for a long time. They prefer to move to bigger cities, more developed areas, or universities with higher rankings and better reputations. As a result, I ended up studying in a place with limited academic resources. So overall, for me, this education was mainly a way to get a visa and stay in the country, rather than something that really improved my professional level. It helped me remain in New Zealand, but it was not the place where I wanted to settle down academically or professionally. If we talk more generally about studying abroad, I think it really does have an impact, just not always in an academic way. For me, it was more about trying to figure out how a new system works and how to adapt to it. Studying abroad definitely helps to broaden your worldview and change the way you approach things. It teaches you independence, responsibility, and a more open mindset. In that sense, it was useful for me, even if not in the way I initially expected. The learning style is very different. Teachers usually give you a topic, but they do not explain everything in detail, and they do not guide you step by step. You are not pushed very much. Instead, everything is on you. You decide what to study, how deep to go, and what exactly you want to focus on. At first, I struggled with this approach because I was used to a more structured system. This freedom sounds great, but in reality, you often end up spending much more time on studying. You have to search for information yourself, organize everything on your own, and take full responsibility for the result. So yes, studying abroad can teach you independence and self-discipline, but it is not always efficient in terms of time. You often invest much more effort to get the same or even a smaller academic result compared to more structured education systems. For me personally, it was not a waste of time, but the value was more personal than professional. It helped me grow as a person, but it was not the place where I wanted to settle down academically. Honestly, it was a big and unpleasant surprise for me. I really expected much more, not only from the institute itself, but from studying abroad in general. I had a very different image of what education in New Zealand would be like, and I clearly underestimated how different reality could be. Here I need to explain something important. I had been to New Zealand before. Back in 2009, I came to Auckland to study English, and I absolutely loved the city. Auckland made a very strong impression on me, and at that time, I even wanted to settle down there permanently. But later, I returned to Russia, finished my university studies, started working, and only after that decided to go abroad again to study. When I made that decision, I chose Invercargill mainly because education there was cheaper, and I also had some acquaintances in New Zealand. They told me that it was easier to get accepted to institutes like SIT. Looking back now, I understand that I was quite naive. I did not really try to figure out how different cities in New Zealand could be. I honestly thought that the whole country would be more or less like Auckland. that was my mistake. I did not do enough research before moving. I did not properly understand what kind of city Invercargill was, or what level of education I should expect there. I made the decision very quickly, almost impulsively. I decided to go, and 2 months later, I ended up there. So yes, the disappointment was quite strong. When I arrived, I very quickly realized that not all of New Zealand is like Auckland. Invercargill is completely different. At first, I really struggled to accept this reality. But at that point, it already felt too late to turn back, so I had no choice but to stay, adapt, and keep going. Since we already touched on this topic, I can talk about my impressions of the city and why it did not match my expectations at all. To be honest, it was very boring. The city felt empty and almost abandoned. There was very little social life, almost no events, and no real sense of movement. At first, I tried to figure out why everything felt so stagnant, but over time, I realized that this was simply the normal rhythm of life there. People often say that locals are very spiritual and kind, but in my personal experience, many of them felt quite two-faced. On the surface, they were polite and friendly, but deeper conversations were hard to build. I would describe many people as quite narrow-minded. Not everyone, of course, but a large part of the population. They seemed very limited in how they viewed the world. It felt like many people were living in a very closed reality, almost stuck in an old mindset, something close to a Victorian-style way of life. There was very little openness to new ideas or different perspectives, and that made it difficult for me to connect. For someone who comes from a bigger city, this contrast is especially hard. I came from an environment where there was always social life, events, discussions, educated people around, people with broad horizons. Back home, my circle consisted of curious, intelligent people who wanted to grow and develop. And then suddenly, I ended up in a very small and remote town. Honestly, it felt similar to moving to a very isolated village, a place where people are not really interested in personal growth or change, and where daily life follows the same routine year after year. Because of this, I really struggled emotionally at first. I understood quite quickly that this was not a place where I could settle down long-term or feel fulfilled. That contrast between my expectations and reality was very strong, and it became one of the main reasons why living there felt so uncomfortable and disappointing for me. Sure, I can give a few very everyday examples, so it's clearer what I mean when I talk about people and their mindset there. For example, let's take relationships between men and women. In that town, if a girl is simply standing next to a guy, even a meter away, or just says hi to him, or replies to his message, people immediately assume that they are dating. Very quickly, rumors start spreading, and suddenly everyone is talking about it. Coming from a different environment, I really struggled to understand this way of thinking. Back home, it's completely normal to talk to people, reply to messages, or be friendly without any romantic meaning. There, I constantly had to figure out how my actions might look from the outside, as if any normal interaction could be seen as something inappropriate. Even answering a message could be judged. Another example is social behavior in general. In shops or public places, people are extremely polite. They smile, say hello, ask how you're doing. That's just the social norm. On the surface, everything looks very friendly and pleasant. But at the same time, behind your back, those same people can easily gossip or talk badly about you. You turn away for a moment, and suddenly you hear that someone is saying unpleasant things, even though you haven't done anything wrong. This contrast between outward politeness and real attitudes was very uncomfortable for me. There were also moments that showed how limited people's knowledge and worldview could be. Some people would seriously talk about the Soviet Union as if it still existed, saying things like, someone is going to attack it, or that it wants to conquer the world. I would sit there and realize that I had moved on from this a long time ago, while for them, it was still a real topic. I also ended up in conversations where people said things like, my grandparents moved from Russia, from Kiev. When I explained that Kiev is the capital of Ukraine, I often saw genuine confusion. Ukraine? What's that? It felt like, for many people, Ukraine barely existed in their understanding at all, especially before Crimea. All of this together created a strong feeling that many people lived in a very closed informational and cultural bubble. Because of that, I realized that this was not a place where I could truly connect with others or settle down emotionally. The hardest part was not the city itself, but the constant feeling that meaningful, deeper connection was almost impossible there. If we talk about the cost of education, my studies in that city lasted about a year and a half. The tuition itself cost around 19,000 New Zealand dollars. On top of that, there were living expenses. When I try to figure out the numbers now, accommodation and daily life probably cost another $20,000 to $25,000. So overall, including both tuition and living costs, I ended up spending somewhere between 40,000 and 50,000 New Zealand dollars for roughly 2 years. One of the main reasons I chose that city was because it was cheaper. At that moment, I was trying to save money and not overspend, especially since I didn't know yet whether I would settle down in New Zealand long-term or not. Compared to bigger cities like Auckland or Wellington, education and living costs there were noticeably lower. In Auckland or Wellington, it would have been much more expensive, probably at least 1.5 times more. At the same time, looking back, I honestly struggle to say that the education itself was worth that amount of money. Even though it was cheaper than in bigger cities, the quality simply didn't match the cost. To be honest, the education at that institute was definitely not worth the money. As for finances, yes, I did have savings when I moved. I left Russia in 2013, and at that time, the exchange rate was very different. $1 was about 27 rubles. Because of that, my savings felt quite solid. At that stage, I didn't really struggle financially. I had accumulated enough money to live in New Zealand fairly comfortably for about 2 years without serious stress. I didn't have to immediately figure out how to survive or look for any job just to pay basic bills. Back then, I also wasn't thinking about settling down permanently. My main focus was studying and adapting, not long-term plans. I believed my savings would be enough to cover both my education and everyday life. Looking back now, I understand that I was quite optimistic. At that moment, everything looked stable, and I didn't expect how quickly circumstances could change, or how things could eventually end up much more complicated than I had planned. Later, the situation changed very sharply. After the events around Crimea, the ruble collapsed, and the exchange rate of the dollar almost doubled. All my savings were in rubles, so I lost a huge part of my money, almost half of it. This is when I really started to struggle financially. What once felt stable suddenly turned into constant stress. After about a year, I had no choice but to start working in New Zealand, as much as my visa allowed at that time. I had to quickly figure out how to survive with much less money than I originally planned. Before that, my plan was simple: live on my savings, study, and slowly adapt. But because of the currency collapse, everything changed. Instead of calmly focusing on education, I ended up needing to work just to cover basic expenses. At that point, there was no talk about settling down or long-term comfort. It was purely about adapting fast and dealing with a situation I couldn't control. Finding a job was quite difficult. According to my student visa, I was allowed to work up to 20 hours per week and up to 40 hours during holidays. On paper, everything looked manageable, but reality was very different. In Invercargill, I really struggled to find work. The community there is very small and quite closed. Most jobs are filled through personal connections. People hire friends, relatives, or someone they already know. When you arrive without contacts, you quickly figure out that sending resumes alone doesn't get you very far. I applied to different places and tried various options, but without recommendations, the chances were minimal. In the end, I ended up finding work only through someone I studied with, who recommended me. That experience made it very clear that in small towns like this, networking matters much more than motivation or skills. At that stage, I wasn't thinking about settling down or building a long-term career. My main goal was simply to get any job I could and survive in a new country. Yes, in practice, finding a job was almost entirely about connections. Very quickly, I figured out that people mostly hired their friends or people they already knew. In my case, I also ended up finding my first job through a classmate I studied with. He recommended me, and that was basically the only reason I got the position. The job itself was very low-skilled. I worked as a merchandiser, and the shifts started extremely early, sometimes at 3 or even 3:30 in the morning. What really surprised me was that even for this kind of work, you still needed a recommendation. Without connections, you would simply struggle to get hired at all. At that time, there were very few jobs in general. The city felt almost not alive, both economically and socially. There was simply not much work available, and for someone new, it was very hard to find a place. A few years later, the situation improved a bit. More students arrived and more jobs appeared, but when I first came, it was extremely difficult to support myself. Looking back now, I think moving to a bigger city like Auckland, Wellington, or even Christchurch might have been a better decision. Yes, education there was more expensive, but many people I knew who studied in those cities found jobs much more easily. They didn't struggle the same way and were able to support themselves with regular daytime work. So in the end, it feels like you choose a cheaper city thinking you will save money, but then you end up losing that advantage because you can't find work. At that stage of life, it definitely wasn't a place where I could settle down comfortably. It was more about surviving than building a future. After I finished my studies, I started looking for a job. I didn't move anywhere right away and stayed in Invercargill at that time because I was trying to figure out how to find work and what options I realistically had from there. Because I lost a large part of my savings due to the currency exchange rate, I had no real choice but to work in Invercargill. I can't say that I earned a lot of money or managed to save much. I mostly worked just to survive and support myself. Financially, it was a constant struggle. I stayed in Invercargill for some time, continued working, and kept looking for better opportunities. Later, I ended up moving to another city for work. There, I worked in customer service, selling tickets at an entertainment center. It had nothing to do with my profession, but in New Zealand, local work experience is extremely important. This kind of experience really helps later on, either when you're trying to find a better job or simply because you start meeting people and building connections. Over time, You begin to understand how things work here. By the end of that year, I finally got a more office-based position. I was hired by SIT, the same institute where I had studied before. They hired me as a former student, and this job helped me extend my work visa for another 1 or 2 years. That step was very important for me. It gave me legal stability and allowed me to stay in the country. At that point, I wasn't really ready to settle down, but I finally felt that I had some ground under my feet and could start building my life more consciously. At that time, my emotional state was not good at all. I was not inspired. I was actually very disappointed. I was trying to figure out what went wrong and why everything felt so heavy. First of all, I lost a lot of money because of the currency exchange situation. That was a serious blow for me. Second, I was deeply disappointed in the education itself, in the program, in the teachers, and in the overall level of professionalism. I expected much more, and the gap between expectations and reality was very painful to figure out emotionally. On top of that, I was working night shifts. My workday often started at 3:30 in the morning, so I constantly lacked sleep. All of this turned into a daily struggle. I felt tired, sad, and emotionally exhausted almost all the time. This low emotional state lasted for quite a long time, probably around 3 years. I couldn't just snap out of it or quickly figure out how to change my situation. The main reason was the lack of self-realization. Back in Vladivostok, I had a very interesting job, good colleagues, and a fast-growing career. After graduating from university there, my career really started going up quickly. I felt motivated, involved, and fulfilled. After moving abroad, everything changed. I ended up in a situation where it felt like a sharp fall, almost like you rise very fast and then suddenly hit the ground face first. It wasn't about losing status, but about losing inner drive. I lost that feeling of growth, challenge, and enjoyment from work. In the new environment, I faced a lot of unprofessionalism, a very different mentality, and complete loneliness. I had no family, no close friends, no support system. I ended up being completely on my own, and emotionally, that was very hard. For me, having an interesting job and developing professionally is extremely important. I need challenges. I need to feel that my work pushes me forward. Without that, I start to struggle internally. In New Zealand, especially outside big cities, there are very few opportunities for real career growth and truly interesting positions. Until I found a job that gave me this sense of challenge and development, I constantly felt like I had made my life worse instead of better. At that time, I definitely wasn't ready to settle down or feel stable. I was still trying to figure out my place, my direction, and whether this country was really right for me. That feeling stayed with me for a long time. Right now, I feel much better emotionally. It took time to figure out myself and everything I went through, but today I feel much more stable inside. And no, I do not regret choosing this path. I do not regret leaving Russia. I always wanted to get experience of living abroad, studying, working, and building a life in another country. This idea really appealed to me, and I still believe that this experience was very valuable. This path made me stronger. It shaped me as a person. Even when I had to struggle, it gave me new perspectives, new ways of thinking, and a deeper understanding of life and of myself. Those difficult periods were not pointless. They helped me grow. So I would not say that my mistake was leaving or choosing this path in general. The experience itself was right and important for me, even if it wasn't easy. At the same time, I also understand something very clearly now. I would not want to live in New Zealand permanently. I don't see myself settling down here for the rest of my life. This realization came with time. I had to go through this whole journey, make mistakes, end up in situations I didn't expect, and slowly figure out what really suits me and what does not. In that sense, even my mistakes were useful. They helped me understand myself better and be more honest about what I want from life. So no, I do not regret the path itself, but I do understand now that New Zealand is not the place where I see my long-term future, and that realization feels very clear and calm for me today. At this stage of my life, I clearly understand that New Zealand is not the last country where I will live. It took time to figure out my feelings about this place and about myself, but now this understanding is very clear. I do think about the possibility of moving again. If such an opportunity appears in the future, I would definitely consider it. I am open to change, and I no longer see moving as something scary or wrong. This experience taught me that life does not always mean staying in one place forever. Sometimes you move on not because you struggle too much, but because you feel that another country or another environment might suit you better at this stage of your life. I don't feel an urgent need to settle down here permanently. Instead, I allow myself to stay flexible and honest about what I want. I understand that I might end up in a completely different country than I once imagined, and that's okay. So yes, if the right opportunity appears, I am ready to leave New Zealand and try living somewhere else, with much more awareness and confidence than I had before. At the moment, my life is quite stable, even though it looks very different from what it used to be. Right now, I am not working because I am on maternity leave. I have a child, I am married, and this stage of life feels calmer and more balanced. Of course, there are moments when you struggle, like any new parent does, but overall, emotionally, I feel quite good. I wouldn't say that I feel depressed or unhappy. The transition from work life to motherhood was a big step, and it completely changed my daily routine and priorities. It took time to figure out how to live in this new rhythm, but now I feel comfortable with it. We are renting our home, and this is a very conscious choice for us. We don't want to buy property here yet because we are still trying to figure out where we truly see our future and whether this is the country where we want to stay long term. At the same time, I don't feel ready to settle down here permanently. My husband also doesn't feel very connected to New Zealand, so there is a real chance that we may end up moving to another country together in the future. For now, though, our situation feels stable, calm, and manageable. And that is exactly what we need at this stage of our lives. If I give some advice to people who are thinking about moving to New Zealand, I would say this. Everything really depends on what you are trying to figure out for yourself and what kind of life you want in the long run. What I truly value in New Zealand is the work-life balance. Here, people genuinely respect your life outside of work. If your priority is to spend time with your family, focus on personal interests, or simply live a calm and balanced life, then New Zealand can be a very good choice for you. This country suits people who want less stress and a slower pace of life. If your goal is stability, peace, and emotional comfort, and you don't want to constantly struggle with pressure and competition, New Zealand may feel right. However, there are also things you should think about very carefully. Life here can be very boring, especially if you live outside of Auckland. In smaller cities, there is very little going on socially or culturally, and many people end up feeling isolated if they are used to a more active lifestyle. Another important point is communication and mentality. If you are a very straightforward person and value honesty and directness, New Zealand might not suit you. People here are polite and friendly on the surface, but often not very direct or open, which can be hard to figure out at first. Also, if you are coming to New Zealand mainly for career growth, professional challenges, or ambition, this is probably not the best country for that. There are very limited opportunities for fast career development, especially outside of major cities, and many ambitious people eventually struggle with feeling professionally stuck. So, in short, New Zealand is great for calm, balance, family life, and low stress, especially if you want to settle down and live a quieter life. But if you are looking for strong professional growth, excitement, and big career challenges, you should seriously think twice before choosing this country. At the same time, for the right type of person, New Zealand can be exactly what they are looking for. It all depends on where you want to end up. If I think about moving again in the future, the countries I would consider right now are Australia and Germany. At this stage of my life, I'm still trying to figure out where I would feel most comfortable long term. People often ask me whether Australia is very different from New Zealand in the aspects we talked about. To be honest, I haven't been there yet. I actually planned to visit Australia to see the country in person and figure out how life really feels there. But then COVID started and those plans didn't happen. Because of that, I can't say much yet about job opportunities or career prospects there. I don't have first-hand experience, so I don't want to make assumptions and end up disappointed later. But what I do know for sure is that Australia is warmer, and the cities there are much more developed. There is more social life, more things happening, and more overall movement. People who move there seem to struggle less with boredom, especially if they are active and social. For me personally, this is very important. I need to feel that life is happening around me. I don't necessarily want to settle down in a place that feels too quiet or stagnant. I feel that Australia might offer more energy, opportunities, and social interaction compared to New Zealand. And that's why it's high on my list right now. If we talk about the climate, it really depends a lot on where you live in New Zealand. And it takes time to figure out what kind of weather you can actually live with long term. For example, in the very south, in Invercargill, the climate is mostly cold and gloomy. It's a very overcast city and can feel quite depressing. The sky is usually very low, there is strong wind, and it rains a lot. The weather often feels damp and unpleasant. Even in summer, it can feel cold. Many people who move there struggle with the lack of sunlight and constant bad weather. Of course, there are sunny and warm days sometimes, but they are quite rare. If we talk about the area where I live now, it's also near the ocean, so the weather is still unpredictable. There are many foggy days and quite a lot of rain, but not as much as in Invercargill. I didn't end up in such a gloomy place again, and overall this area feels much sunnier and more comfortable. However, the humidity here is very high. For me personally, this is not a big problem, because I am from Vladivostok, from the Primorsky region, and this kind of climate feels familiar to me. Still, it's something you really need to consider before you decide where to settle down in New Zealand. What I personally miss here is seasonality, and it took me a long time to figure out why the climate was affecting me so much emotionally. From autumn to spring, the weather feels almost the same all the time. It's cold, rainy, gray, and very monotonous. There is not much contrast between seasons, and over time, many people struggle with this constant sameness. It slowly drains your energy. If I compare it to Russia, especially to Vladivostok in the Primorsky region, it was very different there. Winters were cold, but they were sunny and clear. Even though it was freezing, there was light blue sky and a strong feeling of a real season. You didn't end up feeling stuck in endless gray weather. Here, it's different. There is much more rain, much more humidity, and a constant damp feeling. From autumn through spring, everything feels flat and repetitive, with very little change. This made me realize that climate is something you really need to think about before you decide where to settle down, because it affects you more than you expect. Yes, we have thought about moving to a bigger city within New Zealand, especially to Auckland. We really want to move there, and we are actively trying to figure out the best moment to do it without harming our financial stability. However, right now we have some personal circumstances. At the moment, our family depends on one income because I am at home with a child. In Auckland, salaries are generally lower than where we live now, while rent for housing is higher. So if we moved right now, we would end up losing money financially instead of improving our situation. That is why we decided not to rush. We understand that if we move too early, we may struggle much more than necessary. By the end of next year, or in about a year, I plan to return to work. After that, we are almost 100% sure that we will do everything possible to move to Auckland and try to settle down there in a more stable way. As for government support, we are not receiving any assistance now. During the first year after childbirth, we did receive support. For the first year, everyone who has a child gets about $60 per week. After the first year, it depends on the total family income. If your income is below a certain threshold, you can continue receiving this support in the second year. If the income is even lower, it may continue into the third year as well. But honestly, $60 per week in New Zealand does not solve much. It helps a little, but many families still struggle with everyday expenses. That amount is enough to cover maybe around 8 hours of daycare per week, or to buy 2 or 3 jars of baby food if they are on sale, or a few packs of diapers. We usually buy 3 packs, and that lasts us about 2 weeks. So financially, this support does not make a big difference. It does not really change the situation. It just slightly softens it. For comparison, the minimum wage here before tax is about $20 per hour. So those $60 equal roughly 3 hours of work at minimum wage, which helps you survive, but does not help you truly settle down or feel financially secure. If I had to give advice to people who are planning to move to New Zealand, the first thing I would say is pay close attention to reviews. Try to figure out as much as possible before you move. Look carefully at feedback about educational institutions, workplaces, and especially about the city or area where you plan to live. Weather conditions are also very important. Climate can seriously affect your mood, motivation, and overall quality of life. Many people underestimate this and end up feeling unhappy simply because the climate does not suit them. So it's something you should think about in advance, not after you arrive. Another important factor is people. If you already have friends or acquaintances in New Zealand, it may be much easier emotionally to move closer to them. Without a support system, many newcomers struggle much more during the first months or even years. Having familiar people nearby can make adaptation much smoother. At the same time, it really depends on your goals. Some people want to move abroad and completely distance themselves from Russian-speaking communities. In that case, smaller cities might suit them better because there are very few Russian speakers there, and it is easier to fully immerse yourself in a new environment. If, however, you want to maintain contact with the Russian-speaking community, then bigger cities are a better option. Cities like Auckland or Wellington have the largest and most organized Russian-speaking communities. This is often important for people who plan to settle down long-term and want a sense of belonging and support. This is especially important for families. If you move with children and want them to keep the Russian language, Auckland is probably the best choice. There are Russian-speaking schools, clubs, and many families where children continue speaking Russian. In smaller towns, parents often struggle to maintain the language because children are fully immersed in an English-speaking environment. Work opportunities are another key point. If your goal is to find a job, then larger cities again make more sense. Auckland, Wellington, and Christchurch offer more options and a wider job market. People who move to smaller towns without a clear plan sometimes end up disappointed because of limited employment opportunities. At the same time, there are options for specialists with very specific skills. There are employer-sponsored visas and talent-based visas for narrow professionals. In such cases, it is possible to move to a smaller city and even earn more. But without in-demand skills, it can be very hard to figure out a sustainable career path there. So overall, planning a move to New Zealand requires careful thinking about priorities: work, family, language, community, lifestyle, and climate. If you approach this thoughtfully, you have a much better chance to settle down comfortably instead of constantly struggling and questioning your decision. My child has been going to daycare since the age of 8 months. In New Zealand, the daycare situation really depends on the specific place, so choosing the right one is crucial. You really have to figure out what works for your child, because there is no single standard. I personally spent a lot of time searching for a daycare. I visited many of them just to see how things were organized in real life. In some places, I honestly wanted to leave immediately. The conditions were very poor, hygiene was bad, and many children were clearly sick. Not serious illnesses, but constant runny noses, coughing, and an overall unhealthy environment. I could easily see how a child might end up being sick all the time in such places. I was also not always satisfied with the qualifications of the caregivers. When I asked what activities children do during the day, the answers often disappointed me. I even visited a Montessori daycare, but that approach did not suit me either. In many places, especially here in Dunedin, children are given almost complete freedom. They are barely guided. If a child wants to sit with a tablet for 4 hours, they are allowed to. If they want to lie on the floor for hours, no one interferes. For parents like me, it can be hard to accept, and many parents actually struggle with this lack of structure. That said, daycares here are very different. They all have different schedules and conditions. In our case, we choose how many hours our child attends. He goes for 2 or 3 hours a day, and sometimes 4 or 5. I adjust the schedule based on what works for me, when it's convenient to bring him and pick him up, not based on what is convenient for the daycare. This flexibility helps our family settle down into a rhythm that feels comfortable. What I really appreciate about the daycare my son attends now is their attitude toward children. They truly treat them like children, with care, patience, and warmth. By law, there should be no more than 5 children per caregiver. In our daycare, they try to keep it even lower, usually no more than 3 children per caregiver. If someone is sick, it might increase to 4, but even then they manage to give attention to every child. They don't force children into strict routines. If a child is hungry, they are fed. If a child wants to sleep, they are allowed to sleep according to the schedule discussed with the parents, not when the caregivers decide. Everything is flexible and centered around the child, which makes it much easier for families to figure out what works best. The caregivers act almost like second mothers. They comfort the children, hug them, and support them emotionally. If a child cries when arriving, the mother is allowed to stay for 15, 20, or even 30 minutes to help with adaptation. The goal is to make sure the child doesn't struggle emotionally and feels safe. This kind, human approach is something I really value. But it's important to understand that not all daycares are like this. You can easily end up in a place that doesn't suit your child at all if you don't look carefully. You need to visit, observe, ask questions, and choose what truly fits your family. As for cost, it varies a lot, depending on the daycare and the number of hours you choose. Right now, we pay about $6.50 per hour for daycare. By local standards, this is considered quite affordable because the daycare is partially funded by the government. There are other places where prices reach $7 to $7.50 per hour, or even higher. Ours is not fully subsidized, but compared to many others, it's still a reasonable option once you figure out how childcare pricing works here. At the moment, I am not working. I stay at home with my child, and the time he spends at daycare is quite limited, about 16 hours per week. We don't have relatives or close friends here who could help with childcare, so while my husband is at work, everything at home is on me. That daycare time is mostly used to rest, recover, and handle basic household tasks. If I tried to work during those hours, I would quickly end up exhausted. Right now, my husband is the only one working in our family. I wouldn't say that we seriously struggle with money, but over the past 3 months, we have clearly felt the impact of inflation in New Zealand. About half a year ago, our monthly spending on everyday life, not including bills, was around $1,600 to $1,800. That covered groceries, occasional restaurants, small events, massages, beauty treatments, and simple leisure. We could live quite comfortably and didn't have to think too much about every expense. Now, the situation is very different. With the same $1,600 to $1,800, we can afford mostly groceries and basic household items like cleaning products. Restaurants, massages, and other small pleasures have disappeared from our budget. Prices have gone up so much that you really have to figure out what is essential and what you can no longer afford. In our specific case, we are still managing, but it's very important to understand one thing. My husband's salary is actually above average for his field in New Zealand. This is not a typical income. I want to stress this because someone might listen to this and think everything is easy and then end up shocked when reality turns out to be very different. To live well in New Zealand, a family realistically needs at least 2 average salaries. Ideally, you would also already have a fully paid-off home without a mortgage. Only then does life feel truly comfortable, stable, and calm enough to settle down. If a family relies on only one income while paying rent or a mortgage, especially with children, it becomes financially very hard. Many families in this situation constantly struggle to balance expenses. That's why I think this conversation can be quite sobering. It may help people adjust their expectations before moving, instead of arriving and realizing they miscalculated everything. One last thing I really want to emphasize is planning. It's extremely important to clearly understand where you are going and what you plan to do. You need a concrete plan: what education you will get, what job you will aim for, and how that profession is valued in the country. In New Zealand, practical skills are highly valued. IT specialists, surveyors, environmental professionals, these roles are in demand. But if you work in general business, economics, or management, many immigrants struggle to find their place. Some succeed, of course, but not everyone. In my case, I didn't have a very clear plan when I moved, and that made everything harder. I had to figure out many things the hard way. Planning doesn't guarantee success, but it greatly reduces unpleasant surprises and the risk of ending up in a difficult situation. I truly wish everyone who plans to move abroad a smoother path, fewer disappointments, more financial stability, and the ability to eventually settle down in a place that really suits them. My name is Artyom, and I've done around 2,000 interviews with people who moved to completely different countries. I hope you enjoyed this story, and that it maybe helped you improve your English. Don't forget to subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments.